Good afternoon. As previously indicated, my presentation this morning is on incorporating climate change issues into project planning in Trinidad and Tobago. While the causes of climate change remain an issue of debate globally, it is now scientifically documented. The changes documented include increasing temperatures, rising sea levels, altered rainfall patterns, and increases in the occurrence and intensity of hurricanes, which is also associated with storm surges. The Caribbean Community Center for Climate Change has described climate change as the most serious threat to sustainable development facing CARICOM states, and most of the current initiatives to reduce vulnerability of the regions to climate change, broad-scale actions being undertaken by the governments and multilateral agencies. Our paper and presentation acknowledges that design engineers are increasingly being called upon to address climate change issues at a project level, and as such, it looks at addressing climate change issues from a project-based perspective in Trinidad and Tobago. In determining the ways by which specific projects could address climate change issues, we looked at the predictions of climate change in the vicinity of Trinidad and Tobago, existing local policies and regulatory practices, the specific issues to be addressed when planning coastal or other projects that may be affected by climate change. Climate change projections. Climate change has been defined as a statistical significant variation in either the mean state of the climate or its natural variability, persisting for an extended period, typically decades or longer. Due to the complexity of climate change studies and the large number of variables and interactions, climate change predictions have been extremely difficult. To aid in these predictions, extremely complex general circulation models have been used to determine the possible trends in climate change, and the information from these studies were used when looking at the projections of climate change in Trinidad and Tobago. Climate change projections for surface temperature. Data from the PIACO Met Office is traditionally used to be representative for the entire island. For the period 1981 to 2010, these readings indicate that our mean temperature is 26.6 degrees Celsius. The average maximum temperature for the same period is 35 degrees Celsius, and the average minimum temperature is 18.6 degrees Celsius. Based on the UNDP's climate change profile for Trinidad and Tobago, the mean annual temperature has increased by 0.6 degrees Celsius between 1960 and 2009, at an average rate of 0.13 degrees Celsius per decade. This is lower than the observed global temperature increase, and the predicted warming falls within the lower range of the global predictions for temperature rise. Observational data indicates that global temperature rose by 0.85 degrees Celsius between 1880 and 2012, and that temperature is projected to increase between 1 degree to 3.7 degrees during this century. Climate change predictions for sea level rise. Over the period 1950 to 2009, the variation in sea levels in the Caribbean region is 1.8 millimeters per year. This rate is similar to the observed global trend of 1.7 millimeters per year. The predicted rate of global sea level rise varies with different models, indicating rates of as much as 0.002 millimeters per year to 0.019 millimeters per year, resulting in total sea level rise between 0.2 and 2 meters by the year 2100. Sea level rise can result in the direct inundation of low-lying areas, the flooding of coastal areas at high tide, the flooding of further upstream rivers to the backwater effect from high sea levels, coastal mangrove forest alterations due to the changes in the saltwater-freshwater balance in swamps, and increased shoreline erosion, especially when combined with storm surges. Climate change projections for changes in rainfall patterns. The average rainfall for Trinidad and Tobago has been reported to range between 1,900.3 millimeters and 2,200 millimeters, with the monthly average ranging from 31.5 millimeters to 264.7 millimeters. Unpredictable deviations from the regular patterns in Trinidad and Tobago has been attributed to climate change, and studies have indicated a general future trend to drier conditions in various areas of the Caribbean. Predictions for rainfall include decreases in monthly precipitation, an extended dry season, a reduced wet season, and the possibility for increased storm intensities. Increased rainfall intensity increases the likelihood for rainfall that exceeds the carrying capacity of land, and that can lead to flooding. Additionally, decreased rainfall can lead to the reduction in water reserves and increase the potential for drought conditions. And altered rainfall patterns can affect the availability of freshwater resources, both for agriculture and public water supply. Climate change projections for changes in storm and surge patterns. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has indicated that climate change is associated with either decrease in or the maintenance of the global frequency of tropical cyclones. Predictions include the occurrence of more extreme precipitation near the center of tropical cyclones when they make landfall, with increases in both the maximum wind speed and the rain rates in tropical cyclones globally. Tropical cyclones are accompanied by storm surges, which can result in significant damage to coastlines. The combined effect of greater surges associated with more intense tropical cyclones and the effect of those surges combined with increased sea levels means that the problem of coastal erosion is expected to increase in the future. As previously stated, we also looked at the ways through which climate change is currently being addressed locally. Local policies include the National Climate Change Policy and the Draft Integrated Coastal Zone Management Framework. The National Climate Change Policy sets out the guiding principles for climate change policy and strategies for Trinidad and Tobago. These include the need for sustainability, the need for a consultative and multipartite approach, the need to follow a precautionary approach. The response to climate change should be multi-sectoral and include both mitigation and adaptive actions, and it must be evidence-based. The National Climate Change Policy also lists directives and strategies, which include developing a green building code, revising sectoral policies to include considerations of climate change impacts, revising national development plans to incorporate climate change vulnerability, impacts and adaptation options, and enhancing the resilience of natural biophysical systems so as to maximize ecosystem services. The draft framework acknowledges the need for integrated coastal zone management as a strategy to adapt to climate change impacts and reduce the vulnerability to coastal hazards. Of the 11 strategies put forward in the framework, 3 directly address project planning. These include the maintenance of harmony with aesthetics, environmental, and cultural parameters, the protection of people, property, and economic activities from significant risk associated with climate change, and the maintenance of diversity, health, and productivity of coastal and marine processes and ecosystems for the benefit of current and future generations. Local regulatory practices relating to climate change include the actions of the Environmental Management Authority, the Drainage Division, the Town and Country Planning Division, and the Ministry of Works and Infrastructure. The EMA governs the EIA process of Trinidad and Tobago. 11 terms of reference, which guides the preparation of the environmental impact assessments for projects related to port development, port expansion, and shoreline protection over the past 14 years were reviewed, and only one had specific requirements with respect to climate change. The Drainage Division indicated during consultation that they provide input into the preparation of TORs. In addition, the division acknowledges that sea level rise could not only be considered for coastal projects, but also along major rivers due to the backwater effect, and the division has a standard requirement that peak runoff from a development should not exceed the peak runoff before the development. The Town and Country Planning Division indicated that they are aware and concerned about issues surrounding climate change and associated sea level rise. And when dealing with the projects which may be affected by these factors, advice is usually sought from the Institute of Marine Affairs. Over the past several years, NIDCO, on behalf of the Ministry of Works and Infrastructure, has invited tenders for river basin studies and design flood control works. The more recent of these tender documents have required the consultant to examine the IPCC models for the Caribbean region and other climate change models to determine the effect of climate change on the watersheds. Based on the predictions and impact of climate change discussed, the recommendations of local policies and regulatory practices, we now move on to the recommended approaches to addressing climate change issues on a project-based level. So for buildings and other structures. With respect to buildings and other structures, based on the predicted increased intensity of hurricanes in the Caribbean region, a revision to the design wind speed in the building codes is required. An example for St. Lucia has indicated that wind speed adjustments will need to be up between 10 to 14% upward. With respect to coastal defenses, due to the predicted sea level rise and increased storm surge, flooding needs to be addressed. As such, while there are squatting limitations associated with it, the phased construction of coastal defenses is recommended. Additionally, proper calculation of the necessary top elevation of a coastal defense structure should be utilized during design. Ports, docks, and marinas. Rising sea levels combined with higher storm surge can inundate low-lying land within and adjacent to a port. In addition, increased intensity of rainfall can exceed the carrying capacity of drains, resulting in flooding. The design approaches to respond to the issues of inundation or flooding at ports include design drainage structures to accommodate increased rainfall intensity, the elevation of critical items such as electricity substations or warehouses for hazardous cargo above projected flood levels, and the provision of permanent or temporary barriers around critical items. The deck height of docks for smaller vessels is normally less than 1 meter and commonly less than 1/2 meter above the present high tide levels. As such, these can be inundated at high tides in the future as a result of sea level rise. Approaches to addressing these issues include docks with a shorter design life to allow for more frequent rebuilding, deck structures designed to be progressively raised on the same supporting piles, and floating dock structures which maintain a fixed height of deck above sea level. Moving on to water supply projects, we start with river intakes. At most river intake, a base flow is estimated to prevent ecological damage downstream of the way, and also to provide for traditional water users. When the flow in the river falls below or to the base flow level, pumping must cease, and this usually occurs at the height of the dry season. As such, the projected lower annual rainfall longer dry season, and more intense rainfall events associated with climate change will affect the reliability of river intakes as a water supply. Lower annual rainfall will result in lower river flows across the year, thus reducing the water available for pumping at the river intakes. The longer dry season will result in longer periods of the year when river flow is at or less than the base flow and pumping will not be allowed. More intense rainfall events will result in the increased periods when the river flow exceeds the pumping capacity and the surplus simply will flow over the way. Surface impoundments. Surface impoundments, such as dams and reservoirs, work on the principle of storing water during the wet season for use in the water supply system during the dry season. The predicted lower annual rainfall and longer dry season can affect water supply from surface impoundments. Lower annual rainfall will reduce the amount of water available for storage, while a longer dry season will require a larger volume of water storage to ensure that supplies are available for the entire year. In contrast, more intense rainfall will result in a faster filling of the reservoirs. Therefore, given the long working life of dams and reservoirs, new dams and reservoirs should be sized to accommodate low rainfall and longer dry seasons in the long term. Groundwater. Groundwater supplies are recharged by the infiltration from the surface, and sustainable extraction of groundwater depends on the pumping rates that are equal to or lower than the recharge rates. Saltwater intrusion into freshwater aquifers is known to occur in Trinidad and elsewhere in the West Indies due to overpumping. Like overpumping, sea level rise will alter the hydraulic balance between the sea and the aquifer, leading to saltwater intrusion. In this regard, it is possible to respond to climate change in a progressive manner. Initial pumping rates would need to be established based on infiltration rates at the time a well field is established. Salinity in the well field will then need to be monitored frequently during the operation, and the pumping rates lowered once a sign of saline intrusion is noted. Addressing climate change for bridges. Currently, bridges are designed with a 75-year lifespan, even though some remain in use for longer periods. Climate change can affect both the hydraulic capacity of bridges and the structural adequacy. The projected increase in rainfall intensity, increased rainfall, and sea level rise can affect bridges. The projected increase in rainfall intensity will result in higher peak runoffs. More severe hurricanes and the associated increase in rainfall will result in an increased peak runoff. And sea level rise can result in the backwater effect in rivers, increasing the depth of flow under bridges, and may potentially lead to overtopping of bridges. As such, the following may be considered in addressing climate change issues associated with bridges: the update of rainfall duration frequency curves, and ensure that these include a factor in the design calculations to cater for the future effects of climate change. Addressing agriculture. In general, crops in Trinidad and Tobago are rainwatered during the wet season, and there is some irrigation of vegetable crops during the dry season. A longer dry season and a shorter wet season associated with climate change will result in a shorter period in the year when rain-watered agriculture is feasible. To maintain current levels of productivity, crops will have to be irrigated for a longer period of the year. Rather than the use of primitive irrigation practices, which waste a proportion of water to runoff, more efficient systems such as drip irrigation are recommended. Additionally, the government can provide training to farmers on the use of more efficient irrigation systems, as well as financial support in purchasing and installing such systems. In closing, we move to our summary and recommendations. There is now sufficient evidence that climate change is taking place. Specific to Trinidad and Tobago, the expected changes are increased surface temperature, rising sea levels, reduced annual rainfall and a shorter wet season, and increased intensity of tropical cyclones and associated surges. Our paper has shown a trend at the regulatory level to include climate change into the design of specific types of projects. It is important to note that we recommend different approaches to addressing climate change in Trinidad and Tobago. Some projects may require design changes from the very start of the project, and others may allow for a more progressive approach. Overall, we recommend that the regulatory agencies in Trinidad and Tobago should consult with stakeholders and seek a consensus position regarding the projections for each aspect of climate change. Additionally, the building code currently being prepared for Trinidad and Tobago should incorporate the alteration of design wind speeds to address climate change, and statistical methods should be used to prepare predictive rainfall duration frequency curves that would reflect the more intensive rainfall projected. Lastly, it should be noted that the consensus building and code amendments on climate change must properly be led by scientists and engineers in order to be successfully undertaken. Thank you. I'm now open to questions and comments.
Okay, we will entertain one or two questions before we break for lunch, but before we go, we would also beg your indulgence for a few minutes for the presentation of tokens. The floor is open.
Good afternoon. Alan Stewart from the Tobago Emergency Management Agency. Very interesting presentation. What came to mind during the presentation is the whole idea or the concept that we are now buying into that speaks to climate variability. And I was wondering whether or not through your presentation you saw a difference between climate change and climate variability. And if so, would you like to express what you may consider those impacts? For some of the things that I saw in the presentation raise the question as to whether it's really climate change or climate variability that we are dealing with.
Okay, so Sarah is the climate expert that worked on this paper, so I'd like to invite her to answer that question. Thanks.
Hi. What we looked at was, the climate change is occurring. Climate has been varying for as long as the Earth has been around. What we highlighted in the beginning of the paper was that the causative agents for change in climate change has become a very political, a word with political clout, right? In the sciences, we look at climate change and climate variability as the variation in climate and the parameters that contribute to our makeup of what we describe as climate, so there's temperature, precipitation, relative humidity, all of these factors. Climate change is occurring. Scientists all over the world have come to that consensus. Climate change, the political tagline, is used to talk about the anthropogenic effects or anthropogenic impact to the changes in climate, so that humans are the causative agents behind climate change. What we stated in the project is that there is no consensus on that. So we talk about climate change and climate variability in the paper synonymously. Right? But as I said, the word climate change outside of the science has a lot of additional meanings. I don't know if I answered your question or...
Thank Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Prem Nana is my name. I used to be on the board of the EMA, and I was wondering if, for those who at that time we were developing the EIA. I know Dr. Sammy has been working on EIAs quite a lot. Are there green issues now incorporated into the EIA and the CEC? And something bothered me. I live in San Fernando, and I was wondering when Cedrus will meet San Fernando. You have a calculation for that?
Oh, do we?
I hope it's not in my lifetime. Thirdly, did you study any effects on the current changes and salinity in terms of what is happening in climate change in Trinidad today? Thank you.
So with respect to the salinity, we kind of just did a broadband discussion for the saltwater intrusion. We kind of didn't focus on that a whole lot. And the other part of the question, I would like to invite Dr. Sammy to answer.
Prem never used to ask such hard questions when we were. In fact, the question of Cedrus and San Fernando, that's the wrong question. The question is, when will Cedrus be a separate island from San Fernando? Because what we are seeing is erosion along that stretch of land. So you asked the wrong question. Whether it will happen within your lifetime, are you serious about it? The rates are alarming in the context of erosion rates, coastal erosion rates all over the world, but there's still quite a bit of land in between the two. The changes in salinity, we really looked at two aspects of it. Remember, this paper is not original research. This is looking at existing research. We have had situations in Trinidad of saltwater intrusion into some of the northern gravels aquifers, specifically El Socorro and Valsi. The good news, and I'm always careful about giving good news because people seem to think, well, it's good news so we don't have to worry. In both cases, when the saline intrusion became intolerable, they shut down the wells completely. And over 30 years, the water quality has recovered. And that's why we said you can actually take a progressive approach in terms of designing well fields, as long as you're prepared to make the effort and spend the money to monitor consistently. And the minute you see the effects of intrusion, you have to reduce your complaints. But yes, in the particular northern gravels aquifer, it does recover, which doesn't say that in other types of aquifers it will, but in that aquifer it does. I think those were your questions.